Welcome to the Embracing Brokenness podcast, where our goal is to engage with all of those willing to venture deeper into their transformational journey with Christ. Here's your host and co-founder of Embracing Brokenness Ministries, Steve Adams.
Welcome, everyone, to the Embracing Brokenness podcast. You are tuning in to the second part of a two-part interview that I did with Professor Nancy Pearcey. So I would highly encourage you, if you have not heard the first half of this interview, go back, search it out in our previous podcast, and listen in, because we had such an amazing conversation about extremely relevant topics in the world we live in today, and in particular, her recent book that she wrote, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Really good read and highly researched, as you would expect from her. So again, welcome. Glad you could join us. And without further ado, my second half of the interview on this podcast with Nancy Pearcey. Nancy, your book says criticism of men begin much earlier than most of us think, right? So this idea of toxic masculinity, this is not necessarily new, right? It's new the way we define it, but you go back a little bit. Where does it come from? Where originally? Where help us out understand that.
Yeah, most people do kind of think it started in the 1960s with second wave feminism. It started much earlier. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
Before that, fathers worked alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family business, the family industry. And so the expectation for manhood focused on their caretaking role, their responsibility for their family. They had to be gentle and patient because they're working with their kids, and they're preparing their children for the skills they will need for the adult world. Most child-rearing books back then, which would be sermons, advice manuals, and so on, were written to fathers, not to mothers, which they are today, right? Go bookstore today, they're almost all for mothers. They weren't written for mothers, they were written for fathers, because fathers were expected to be just as involved with their children as mothers were. They were home all day, right? And the home and its outbuildings and the fields surrounding and so on. In fact, fathers were expected to be even more important in terms of intellectual and spiritual growth and direction to their children. So how did we lose that? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, men were not working alongside people that they loved and had a moral bond with. They were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's where you start to see the language change. People began to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they had had before in the colonial era, that they were becoming self-interested, egocentric, greedy, acquisitive, competitive, make it at all costs, look out for number one. And that's when the literature changed. You start to see people, for the first time, negative language was applied to the male character. So if we want to understand where it started when the father was essentially removed from the family for most of the day, which of course then leads to a later chapter where I do get to some solutions. Mm-hmm. But I have had some people say, thanks for not just blaming feminism. the easy answer.
Yeah.
No, it's actually, it way preceded feminism.
Sure.
When I talk about the literature of the day already starting to criticize men, these were not feminist writers. They were mostly Christian, in fact. Wow. Because not only were men losing close contact with their families, but they were also becoming more secular. As the Industrial Revolution led to the creation of these large public institutions like factories and offices, financial institutions, universities, and of course the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public arena, which is what we hear today too. Yes. But if values were not to be cultivated in the public arena, where would they be cultivated? In the private. arena, in the home. And so there's sort of a sacred secular split, right, where men are working in this secularized environment all day, and then coming home and trying to cross over into becoming Christian again when they're home, which doesn't really work very well.
No.
But you see a lot of the literature of the day saying that men are being split in half. You know, they're expected to operate by secular principles all day, and then somehow they're supposed to come home and be these wonderful Christian husbands and fathers. And so it was largely Christians who were protesting, not feminists. You know, there were some early stages of feminism happening back then, but it was Christians who were saying, our husbands are becoming more secular. They're no longer operating, governing their behavior by biblical ethics. So it was from the clergy and from the men's wives who were saying, you know, we need to see how we can bring our husbands back to a more Christian understanding, of masculinity and manhood.
Yeah, and you know, that's logically speaking, right? We can just intuitively look at that and say, well, that's still the case today when we are a very selfish, self-driven society. I remember when I was growing up, my goal, even as I believed in Jesus as early as I can remember, but I also was pulled into the world system of meeting my significance by their standards, right? So I would be more about we call them isms around here, but the things that I chased to sort of make myself feel better about that was, you know, my balance sheet. So I'd be chasing out in a corporate world, and even in my own business, doing what I could do to accumulate stuff. And of course, who gets neglected most is the family unit, the one that God brought together to be together. And you can just see how it strips society of male influence in the home in a way. I think you even referred to, if I'm not mistaken, you talked about alcoholism even increasing right at that time over the result of this, right?
Yes, exactly. As men were not governing their behavior so much by Christian principles, there was a huge increase in sort of what we might call the traditional male vices.
Yeah.
Gambling, drinking, visiting prostitutes,
right,
crime, and gang activity, all mushroomed in the 19th century. And that's why, in fact, there were so many reform movements in the 19th century. They also blossomed in response to all of this. And so the only problem with the reform movements is that they tended to pit women and men against each other,
right, because
it was men who were becoming more secular, right? They were going to secular universities, working in the secular environment. And by the way, I'm happy that you put it right then is, you know, for many men, it was their work. It was their career that became their idol.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the word that was used back then by several critics. They said, work is becoming the idol for many men. And so, if values were kicked out of the public sphere, they were relegated to the private sphere. And who's in the private realm still? Well, women are. So for the first time ever in human history, in the 19th century, women was said to be morally superior to men. And you have to realize what a huge change this was. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Yeah. It had been thought that men were morally superior to women.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because they thought the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational.
Yes.
And therefore men would be more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin. vir is the Latin word for man, as in the word virile. So virtue actually had overtones of manly strength and honor. So it was completely new in the 19th century. People began to say that women were morally and spiritually superior. And it was women who drove a lot of the reform movements then. You mentioned alcohol, and sometimes a single fact can help crystallize things. Yes. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
You know what? I remember you saying that. That's one of those like mind-blowing statements you would have never thought about being true. It's incredible.
And that's why there was a temperance movement. Yeah. There was an abolition movement against slavery. There was the so-called social purity movement, which was against sex trafficking and prostitution. There's a whole host of movements, but they were largely led by women. Mm-hmm. And so although they did a lot of good, it also created some tension between men and women because as one historian said, there was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keepers, slave masters, drunkards, and seducers.
Oh my gosh.
So there was the tension that we see even today in the Me Too movement. I mean, it's already back in the 19th century, where women were saying, we need to bring our men back to a more biblical morality, and men, of course, not always liking that, because men don't like another person being their conscience. We have to help them to realize it's not women's morality, it's God's morality that we're calling men to, and that makes all the difference.
Well, can I applaud women for stepping up back then to actually help right the train on the wrong set of tracks? I think at that point, although I mean, we were doomed to repeat cycles over and over again. This is why, for anyone listening that does not have a personal relationship with Jesus, explore that, because there's a lot to be said about how to write that from a biblical perspective, from a relationship and intimacy with God, that helps change the narrative, as we were talking about earlier. So thank you for sharing those truths, because we can see such parallels in the society we live in. Thankfully, I have a wife that I refer to as Genesis does, and Azer Kenegdo. So we have a co-reigning going on in our household. Took me a while to figure that out, by the way, Nancy, but it came around. Those early days in my life and the stumbles that I took, I'm like, well, I am not exactly reigning in the appropriate manner. So there has to be a little bit of a change here. So you did mention, I think in your chapter title, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Okay, there was a particular sentence. It caught my eye, and I love this because it kind of refers back to what I just said. You said this: "Men and women exercising their gifts are like a violin and cello playing a duet, blending in harmony while keeping their unique individual tones." That is a beautiful picture of how God intends it to be. And as I was saying, today's public rhetoric often is cast men as these villains and women as the victims. So where do these stereotypes come from? Is it still those same things, or is there something that we need to pay attention to?
Well, we talked a little bit about the history of negative criticisms of men, but I have several stages I go through in the book to kind of unpack how the secular script for masculinity developed. And I think perhaps the most interesting one, to me at least, is the rise of Darwinian evolution. We usually think evolution is a matter of, genes and fossils and so on,
right.
But it had a huge influence on secular concepts of masculinity, because Darwinian thinkers began to say the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival had to be rugged, ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory.
Oh, wow.
And that's the language they used. And so for a man to recover his authentic manhood meant to recover the beast within, get in touch with the biological instincts for lust and power. So whereas Christianity urged men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers told men to live down to their animal nature. And by the way, and this is not just past history, because social Darwinism, the application of Darwinism to social issues, has coming back. It's got a new name now. It's now called evolutionary psychology. But it's the same idea that if the body evolved, so did all our ideas, so did all our thinking. And so there's a best-selling book on the subject called The Moral Animal. And the author says the human male is an obsessive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pig.
Holy cow.
Giving men a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving Vikings a book on how not to pillage.
Oh my goodness.
I thought, who needs, we tend to think it's feminists who have a low view of men.
Yeah.
But this is a male author. And there's another book that was just reissued. It's an earlier book that was just reissued by George Gilder. And he too says that men are by nature violent, sexually predatory, irresponsible, They just want to jump on their motorcycle and head off into the sunset as a lone ranger. They're not naturally oriented towards marriage and children and family. And I'm thinking, this is another male author who's essentially saying that men are not naturally oriented towards marriage and family, and that marriage and family, therefore, is contrary to their true nature. And by the way, you mentioned that this was in a chapter titled "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I should say where that comes from.
Oh,
that
sure.
was a Washington. So you don't think it was my words.
Oh, yes, please do. Thank you.
So that was from a Washington Post article.
Oh.
A Washington Post article was titled "Why Can't We Hate Men?" and quoting a gender professor, by the way, gender studies professor. The Huffington Post had an article where the editor said her New Year's resolution was #kill all men.
Oh my gosh. You
can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition."
Oh, that is horrible. Boy, I'm glad I'm secure in who God says I am. Imago Dei,
Hold on, I'll give you a few more. Just
please. Oh, thank you very much. I'm feeling okay though, because all right.
But to get a sense of what men are up against today. So there are books with titles literally like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" And even some men have jumped on the bandwagon. A male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then this one is not in the book because it's more recent, but you may have seen it. The director of the movie Avatar was in the news.
I did
because
see it.
You see that? Testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So this is what we're up against, the incredible hostility to masculinity that we see in the news, in the media. And so I did write my book to say, where's this coming from? You can't really stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. And so that was my goal, is to say, how does the secular world get its concept of masculinity so wrong? How can we counter it?
Thanks for enlightening us on that, because it is a question that most of us men have. And for many, and it is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you hear it enough and think it enough and have it presented to you enough, social media being where most people hang out, it's as if, well, I don't know if it turns into an excuse or not, but it certainly it validates certain behaviors. And I personally, I would say one of two things happen. Folks go ahead and live that out, or they sort of isolate and go, man, there's just no way to beat this. I've got to have a different strategy, right? So, oh my gosh, it's tough.
Yeah, and in fact, historically, the strategy was, by the way, I've read books on the history of men. There are very few of them, a few books.
Wow.
Because of feminism, there were whole libraries on the history of women. There were like 2, 3 really good books on the history of men. And then there were smaller ones like on the history of fatherhood and so on. But as a result, some people read my book and they say, where'd you get this stuff? Well, it's because nobody else is reading the books on men, the history of masculinity. Right. But one of the books is really helpful. It said, eventually men do get tired of being made the villain, right? And historically, there was a turning point where men began to say, well, if men are going to be accused of being lewd, rude, and crude, well, those are not negative features. Those are normative features.
Oh, wow.
And so they began to adopt those features and say, well, this is just who men are.
Nope, there you have it. Yep.
Exactly. And this is just who we are. And that the quotes that I just mentioned, for example, flesh-obsessed pigs, that's coming from the perspective of, well, this is just who men are. Yeah. And I think it's extremely dangerous because if you tell people long enough, one message, they will tend to live up or down to the expectations placed on them. And so I take people back again and again in my book to the cultural mandate. And about half of my students don't even know what that means. So the cultural mandate is Genesis, where God's created the universe and the animals and the plants. And then he finally creates, the acme, the height of his creation is the first human,
right?
First human couple. And the first thing he says to them is why he created them. be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth.
Yes.
And the language of Genesis is so streamlined that you can unpack that.
Yes.
So be fruitful and multiply doesn't mean just the immediate family, but of course, historically, all the social institutions grow out of the family. The extended family becomes a tribe, becomes a village, it becomes a state, a nation, and so on. And specific social institutions are founded for certain purposes. That you need a church, you need a school, you need a marketplace, you need a state. Mm-hmm. So it really encompasses building all of the social institutions. And subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So of course, most cultures start with agriculture, but you go to mining, you go to technology, you go to inventing computers, you go to composing music. One of my students said, "Oh, come on, composing music." And I said, "I play the violin. What's the violin made out of? Wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair." Oh. So all the transcendent beauty that we associate with music does start with harnessing the natural resources, the forces of nature. So that is sometimes called the cultural mandate, because it says that before the fall, right? Pre-fall, when God was giving us instructions on why he created humans, what was their purpose? Yes. It was to create cultures. It was to create civilizations. It was to create history. And so men do find their greatest fulfillment not riding off into the sunset like a Lone Ranger, but to rolling up their sleeves and getting deeply invested in their family to start with, but also other social institutions and creative and productive work that serve other people, and that benefits mankind.
Well, and purpose, it's as you said, it's sewn into us. It's to multiply his image, right? In so many ways, if you think about it, it before we chose to eat that fruit, we just walked and talked with him in the garden. I mean, how amazing was that? So our mandate was pretty easy to understand because we were in harmony with one another and understanding what that expectation looks like. What I love about what is still available to us in some ways is a return to that, at least in the context of a relationship with him, in ways that we can still multiply that image in a way that honors him and obeys his word. And so I think part of what you're sharing is, let's remember, where we came from and what that mandate looked like. Let's see how it was derailed over time in the civilization we live in for so long. I mean, in just the breakdown of society, and what hope might there be. And this is a great time maybe to shift gears and just look at kind of what is the long-term strategy, right, for preventing toxic behavior in men. And, I think you point this out, it's to invest deeply, for fathers to invest deeply in their sons, right? But the media portrays, as we were saying earlier, fathers as incompetent idiots and a lot of other things that you described us to be from the media's perspective, not yours. That it is, it's discouraging. So I guess my question would be, from your perspective, like what practical steps can fathers take to be more involved with their sons, their daughters? What would you see from where you sit?
Yeah, so I'll start with the fact that fathers are regularly mocked and ridiculed in the media, yes. and we all know that. And by the way, I do think that is discouraging men from becoming fathers. I think we all are affected by that kind of negative message. So that 40% of children in America today live apart from their natural fathers. The U.S. has the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. So we are up against a big problem of fatherlessness.
Yes.
But where did that start? We all know fathers are mocked. How did that get started? Once again, you have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, because when men were taken out of the home all day, they did lose touch with their children compared to when they were working side by side, right, all day. They were not as in touch with their children's feelings and emotions and what their kids were thinking and with the family dynamics. And already in the 19th century, you start to see this in the literature of the day. People start saying, fathers have become sort of irrelevant. Fathers have become sort of incompetent, since they don't really know what their kids need anymore. They don't know how to parent their children in the way that they used to. And so that image of the irrelevant, incompetent father started way back in the 19th century. And again, most people were protesting it at the time. They didn't like it. One writer, the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union,
Oh, wow.
was the most influential woman of the entire 19th century, interestingly enough.
A writer.
And she said, the father is meant to be the prototype of the heavenly father. And yet he's gone from Sunday to Sunday. You know, how is this a good thing? So in the book, I do offer some practical things. Like surveys found, the National Fatherhood Initiative did surveys and found that even today, fathers say that the biggest barrier to being close to the kids is work, just like it has been ever since the Industrial Revolution. And so I do talk about some ways where we can flex the workplace. And the pandemic actually had maybe one positive silver lining, which is that a lot of fathers found out they actually like being home more with their kids. Harvard University just did a study. So it's not in the book. It just came out. But 68% of fathers said during the pandemic, I got closer to my children and I don't want to lose that.
Oh, that's really good news.
And I don't want to go back to the office full time. I want something hybrid, you know, something that allows me to be home and take my kids to their soccer practice or whatever. And I'll give you a cool anecdote. Again, the anecdotes helped crystallize it. So this was one of my graduate students. Her husband was an IT professional, and during the pandemic, he came home, worked from home, and because he was home, he was able to be more involved in the family's homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He could take his kids to soccer practice or choir practice. And he picked up so much of the family responsibilities that his wife was able to start a part-time business. And the whole family benefited from the added income. And so I interviewed her husband, and he said, our family is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle.
That is so good.
And then the final cooker was this, though. He said, the time that I used to spend commuting to work every day, I now spend praying with my wife every morning.
Love it.
So anecdotes like that just help us to see that maybe there are some ways that we can try to get a better integration of work and life. You know, what we lost in the Industrial Revolution, maybe we can bring at least some of that back so that fathers and mothers can both be more involved with their children.
Yes. Well, and it's you bringing the awareness into the open, and just for fathers to contemplate, especially those of us who really want to follow God's, guidance in that area as fathers. Take it to Him in prayer. Ask for opportunities. Look for opportunities to go deeper, even volunteering and getting your kids involved in different things. I just think there's ways. I know we're all. Not everybody has the convenience, the ability to work from home. I get that. And in fact, there's a huge population, thankfully, that drive the trucks that get things to us, right? There's that part of it. And for them, it might be even more challenging to stay connected to their sons, their daughters. But I think if anybody watching or listening hasn't figured it out, the book that Nancy wrote is so well researched. Of course, she's known for that. So she's known for that. And I think you cite it all, and there's at least that much in the back of the book used to cite all of your research, but you also even did a piece in the back where people can go deeper and do it to study group or study individually in it, right? So that's going to be really helpful for many of us as well.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I really enjoy doing that. I put study guides in the back of all my books now because yes, it's so helpful, isn't it? For small groups and so on. And before we leave the question of more flexible work places, though, the other thing we need to do is persuade the business world that it's good for them too. And so I don't overlook that. In the book, I quote several CEOs who said things like this. One CEO I quoted said, "We were always hesitant about allowing remote work in the past because, of course, we thought people would slack off."
Absolutely.
And then he said, and this is a direct quote, "That pandemic completely exploded that fear. we were not seeing any decline in productivity. In fact, the opposite. I mean, sometimes when people are working from home, they don't know when to stop.
Well,
right?
that's right. It's true.
And if you've ever worked from home,
Oh,
you know
I have, and I do. Yeah. So I do ministry from home, and sometimes I have to look at the clock and go, oh, wait, I'm supposed to unplug here.
Exactly. And I wanted to say this too. It's two caveats. On the one hand, I'm not saying everybody, home-based work is best for everybody at all times. I'm just concerned about parents.
Yes.
Parents when your kids are young. So that's not everybody. It's not like you're saying, oh, everyone should do this. No, it's just when your children are young. Is there a way to, maybe shape your work life to some degree by your parental status? When you have younger children, you go for, more some hybrid work, for example. And here's another thing. Aspects of most jobs can be done at home. So you are talking about more blue collar workers might not have as many opportunities. True. But so a friend of ours is a mechanic, a car mechanic. He owns his own shop, okay. But he's got a lot of book work to do. Mm-hmm. So he takes that home. So he can be sitting at the kitchen table doing his book work while his kid's doing his homework next to him and can ask him questions. So aspects of almost all jobs can be done at home, not the entire job necessarily, but if you look for aspects, sometimes you can get maybe 2 days or 2 half days at home, whatever. So that I encourage people to think creatively on how, maybe blue collar, or for women, it's pink collar, right? Pink collar work.
Think about that. Yeah.
I gave the example of last time I had my hair cut. There was a woman who had a beauty parlor kind of chair, in her basement.
Oh well,
one chair.
Yeah.
and she had these glass doors that you could look out. She could look out and watch her children playing in a fenced-in backyard while she did my hair. So the point is, it does require being creative. But I like what you were saying earlier. We should urge people that when their children at home, can they maybe creatively think of ways to have some parts of the job, some aspects of the job, where they can combine it better with their family life.
Absolutely. And wow, we could go on for hours, I have a feeling, because there's so much packed in here that I personally gained so much understanding about, because, you hear these things in the peripherals, and, of course, I tuned in and to some other podcasts, and I reading the book and understanding, what God's called you to minister to others, students, but around the world, quite frankly. You have had a huge influence in this country with the platform that God has given you. So I want to ask you this as we're nearing a close. What message would you want to leave to our listeners, our viewers, our audience? Because they're diverse. We have people around the world. We have men and women. We have at different places in society and life, and some with kids, some without kids. But in a general sense, after your experience of writing this, can you give us sort of a way you'd like to encourage or wrap this up for us?
Well, I would say that the one point we've already covered is probably my main point, which is men who actually live out a biblical understanding of masculinity are doing very well. And I want that encouraging message to be the main message. Now, one thing we haven't talked about, and maybe this is a good place to add it in, is because nominal Christian men have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, I did have to deal with the question of abuse. And so at the end of the book, I have 2 chapters on abuse and how the church can handle that issue more effectively. And the nutshell answer is what Jesus says in Matthew 18. How do we hold people accountable for their abuse? And the reason that's so important is because until very recently, most books on abuse held the wife responsible. By the way, numerically speaking, it is most often the husband who is abusive. He is bigger and stronger, so it kind of makes sense that if there's going to be physical abuse, it's usually the husband. But ironically, it was usually the wife was held responsible. Books usually and pastoral counsel typically was, well, you need to love him more, you need to forgive him more, you need to make his favorite foods, you need to have sex more often, and he will blossom into the man you want him to be. That's an actual quote from a pastor who was talking to an abused wife in my book. Well, it turns out that doesn't work. Unfortunately, recently there are books coming out on abuse from a Christian perspective that say, well, look, we know that's not human nature. If there's somebody being a bully, whether it's the playground bully or whether it's a belligerent nation in international affairs, we know that they don't stop if you acquiesce to them. If you try to placate them, it doesn't work. You have to stand up to them.
Right.
And for some reason, that was not applied in marriage. But there are more books by Christian counselors now coming out, and I quote them all, so you can find them in those last 2 chapters. I quote them all because I really wanted people to see, look, there's a change happening in the Christian world and how we deal with issues of abuse. And more counselors are saying, actually, the healthy thing for both the victim and the abuser is Matthew 18.
Yes.
Jesus says, if there's sin, you need to learn how to confront them, not in the wrong way, not angry, not retaliation, but in the hopes of restoration, right? Because the verse ends on, if he listens, you have won a brother. So that's the goal. The goal is to win them over. But often it does take, a godly confrontation, a loving confrontation. And as you know, Matthew 18 says,
right,
first you confront them. And if they don't listen to you, bring a few more witnesses.
yes,
And then if they still don't listen, you bring it before the church.
right.
And if they still don't listen, there might be a role there for church discipline and
Yes.
so on. So the books on abuse are now starting to focus much more on Matthew 18. So that was the one topic that we hadn't really covered, would be those last 2 chapters.
Well, and thank you for doing that, because Matthew 18, it's a critical passage for everyone. I did some coaching consulting work in business and also in faith-based capacity, and I use that a lot to deal with conflict in life in any way, but specifically in the context of where you're going here. I think that's really, really helpful. Thanks for bringing that up, because we as believers now, I've seen circumstances where people who are akin to these situations, they ignore it instead of confronting and coming alongside of a brother or sister and helping them to navigate the difficulties of what that looks like. And what I am encouraged to see, and I happen to attend a church which is very encouraging of Matthew 18 model that Jesus, that he basically shared, and we see probably the most effective way, right, to deal with these types of situations. So, it is for anyone out there that wants a deeper dive on that, be sure to tune into those last few chapters. But it is a critically important thing that we address it, Nancy. Thank you for doing that. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that want to figure out how to connect with you. So can you tell us how to do that?
Sure. So, well, you can buy the book on Amazon, like you can buy everything on Amazon.
Yes.
Or if you prefer, places like christianbook.com. I do have a website. My publisher very generously redesigned it so it's nice and colorful. So you should come on by and see it. NancyPearcey.com. And Pearcey is C-E-Y, P-E-A-R-C-E-Y,
Right.
NancyPearcey.com. You can browse my other books. You can see what else I've written. You can leave a message. And I do read the messages. I don't have time to answer all of them, but I do read them. And so, and of course, I'm pretty active on Twitter and Facebook, if that's your preferred social media.
Exactly.
So, you chimed in yesterday? Didn't you, Steve?
I did. You saw that. See, okay. So Nancy notices. I made a comment on Twitter, I believe, or X. It's X.
Yeah.
So, and I've shared a few of your tweets. I don't know if they're still called that, but I have shared them, and I connect that way. And it's encouraging, right? Because you're pointing people in a direction to understand, and it's what God's called you to do. And so, thank you for that. Remember, everybody, track Nancy down, nancypearcey.com, get the spelling right. It'll be in our show notes. There'll be a ton of links to find everything that you would want to find out about what Nancy's doing, Professor Pearcey. And this is a semester coming into right now. So you've probably got your hands full down at Houston Christian. How many people are you tutoring? How many students are you working with this year?
Oh, you should, to clarify, I actually teach half-time and I'm scholar in residence half-time. And so,
thank you. Yes,
which is wonderful. I mean, it's a perfect balance. So I have just normal sized classes, but I have only two. Full load is 4, so I have 2. And so, but I have to tell you, one of the most fun things of my teaching is that we have auditing students. We've opened our classes to auditing students, and so I get auditors from all around the world. I've had auditors from Switzerland and the Philippines and Australia and where else? Anyway, I get international people coming in on Zoom. People in Switzerland have to get up at 3 a.m. to join the class.
Oh my goodness. Well, so she might have another one, at least here. Anybody else? Track her down, audit.
Yeah. Come on in. And the auditing is fun because there's no pressure. You know,
Right,
you get out of it what you want.
Right.
And if all you want to do is listen in, that's fine too. But some of them are quite active and participate. If you want to, you can participate just like a student in the classroom.
Fantastic.
So that's really fun. That's, to me, that's been one of the highlights of the last couple of years since we started bringing in auditors. I just love it.
That's great. Well, Nancy, thank you. This has been awesome. It's been great getting to know you personally, and I know our audience is going to really enjoy this time that we spent together. I so appreciate you taking the time to do this. Blessings to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and blessings on your ministry. What you're doing is really important.
Oh, thank you.
This was another episode of the Embracing Brokenness podcast. For more information on Embracing Brokenness Ministries, or to subscribe to our blog, podcast, YouTube channel, or engage with us on social media, please visit our website at embracingbrokenness.org. Thanks for joining us.